Okay, so the lecture here is to consider some of the implications of tissue mechanics during gait of diabetes mellitus around the concepts of how humans manage energy during locomotion. The ability to provide an adaptable system of changing compliance and stiffness within musculoskeletal structures is a prerequisite of locomotive health that will be disturbed in diabetes. Diabetes mellitus changes the nature of tissues, and although atrophic changes associated with age, such as sarcopenia and osteopenia, are important, it is the changes in stiffness of the musculoskeletal tissues that are most significant in diabetes. Diabetes causes the loss in the ability to manage shear strain, especially within the deeper tissues, that can then leave the super tissues more vulnerable to insult and damage. Normal stress lowering techniques, such as choosing to walk at a slower walking speed, fail to result in an increased level of tissue compliance in diabetics. Now, a little reminder of how energy works. Remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can merely be managed. So in gait, the amount of energy loaded into the tissues is minimized only to the amount that's necessary to achieve locomotion. Therefore, humans manage energy in gait to try and maximize gait energetics, but to minimize the tissue stresses. To understand the significance of energy management in diabetic gait, let us consider the normal events in gait and the normal energetics that we see during gait. Now, walking is a two-collision event separated by a weight transfer phase. The first collision is an impact that spreads its impact forces over two contact events, one at heel strike and the other at forefoot loading. Now, this is one of the great advantages of human bipedal gait, because we're able to spread those impact loads over two events rather than during a single impact when all the forces are concentrated into that impact. Now, with the heel impact, we're landing on a relatively rigid structure, the rear foot, but of course we do have the plantar fat pad, a very specialized construction in the heel. With the forefoot, we're dealing with an area that is able to adjust and adapt its level of compliance to the impact it receives, but it also, again, does have plantar fatty tissue, although not as structurally organized as we find in the heel. Now, this two-part impact is followed by the weight transfer phase, or mid-stance. Now, that allows the center of mass to pass over the leg, but actually reduces forces, because as the leg extends in the initial part of the mid-stance phase, the center of mass is taken away from the support surface. So the acceleration element of force is actually away from the ground. So the overall force will actually decrease. That's then followed as the center of mass tips anteriorly to the ankle joint with an acceleration as gravitational forces start to pull the center of mass forward and body weight moves towards the forefoot. So again, we get rising forces, which then peak as we go into acceleration, and we actually push and drive against the ground to help us move our center of mass onto the next step. Now, you can actually see these distinctive periods of high force during the gait cycle. So this is what we call the heel strike transient. So we get that initial force here. Then we get a little drop in force, which is actually the plantar flexion moment of the foot rotating around the ankle until we start to get the forefoot onto the ground, which is just here. And then that continues to load through the loading response to peak at the end of loading response. So we've got a heel impact and then a forefoot impact. After that, we enter a period of weight transfer where the center of mass is raised up and over the extending limb, and that causes the center of mass to rise up, reducing the amount of forces, so that at absolute mid-stance, we have a period of low force but high center of mass positioning. Now, during the late mid-stance, the center of mass starts to fall. We get that rotation around the ankle joint. Gravity pulls the center of mass down towards the ground. So we have increased forces, and they continue all the way through late mid-stance until we go into the acceleration phase, when we pick up a peak of force again into the ground as we accelerate off the ground towards the next step. And then, of course, our forces are being transferred to the opposite step, so they rapidly decrease. Now we can also see these forces at play in the horizontal plane, medial lateral forces not being highly significant and far more variable. But if we go to the anterior posterior, we'll talk about this little tiny posteriorly directed force that the ground reaction force picks up initially later. But what we're primarily getting, because the body weight is driving forward into the ground, is we get a ground reaction force pushing back against the foot and back against those tissues. So a posterior shear against the soft tissues, first of all in the heel and then into the forefoot. And as we move into mid-stance, those forces become more and more vertical. But as we go into late mid-stance, the forces start to tip as the ankle's tipping forward into anteriorly directed ground reaction forces, because our body weight is pushing backwards into the ground. Now this continues all the way through until we're actually pushing off the ground, and then slowly decreases again as our weight is transferred onto the next step. Now, although the forces that we generate during acceleration are not those that primarily drive our center of mass to the next step, it actually comes from the centrifugal forces of our swing limb, they are still very important for adding momentum into the next step. So the heel lift of one foot drives the impact into the ground of the next footstep. So it's very important for energetics that that energy is transferred from one foot into the next foot. Now, running gait is a little bit different because it only involves a single glancing collision. And so what happens now is we impact the ground, the ankle then pivots, and then we push off the ground. So effectively, our collision loading angle is quite different to our collision offloading angle. Now, this is true of whether we heel strike or whether we forefoot strike, but here we have a force time curve of a heel strike. And again, you can see the heel strike transient and then the braking peak of force. And then when we go into the acceleration peak of force, the key to look down at now is these horizontal forces. So you can see the body pushing back against the ground as it drives forward. Now, if we were looking at somebody with a forefoot running pattern, we would obviously lose this initial peak and we would get a single hump of braking forces and then tailing away acceleration forces. Now, both walking and running thus involve a phase of absorbing and dissipating impact energy to protect the body from high energy loads, followed by an energy demanding acceleration phase. Both locomotive techniques use the knee, mainly via the quadriceps, as the primary energy buffer, particularly through muscle tendon buffering. But in running, the loads on the knee become proportionately higher than those of the hip, ankle, and foot. Thus, in walking, foot and ankle are far more proportionately significant to energy management than they are during running. Now, in braking, impact energy dissipation is achieved through creating the ability to supply compliance within the lower limbs tissues. For compliant tissues can strain or deform more easily under load. The energy absorbed in that strain can then be released by using it to reform the shape of the tissues when they become unloaded. Therefore, the midfoot and forefoot are stiffened prior to forefoot loading. And that basically makes the foot a nice stiff structure that can become compliant when it's loaded into the ground. So the foot can therefore become deformable once the forefoot loads onto the ground and the energy can be absorbed. Now, during the weight transfer phase or mid-stance phase of gait, some further energy dissipation is required because of the high forces that are generated by the anchor dorsiflexion moment of the body weight rotating over the foot. However, the foot does need to start stiffening to allow it to store some energy and provide a semi-rigid lever for acceleration at heel lift. Now, if the foot was too compliant, then you would lose too much energy when you tried to accelerate. Thus, the foot should become gradually stiffer as stance progresses. So it starts mid-stance quite compliant, but should end mid-stance pretty stiff. Now, acceleration requires that tissue elasticity to store the energy within it. It can then release it, and therefore requires that tissues are stiffened prior to heel lift. By increasing muscle activation within the foot, overall stiffness levels within the musculoskeletal frame of the foot are increased, providing an ideal semi-stiff lever for acceleration. Now, once we have that semi-stiff lever, we have the power from the ankle plantar flexors, which will have been built up during that ankle dorsiflexion moment in mid-stance. That power can now be applied into the ground to create a high ground reaction force of positive work that's going to provide that nice stable forefoot platform for the weight to be transferred to the next step. Now, the foot uses 4 primary techniques to adjust its stiffness and compliance. The first 2 actually involve the behavior of connective tissue through their viscoelastic properties. These properties are stiffening through stress stiffening behavior, in that they become more stiff under increasing strain. So when you start to stretch connective tissues, initially actually it's very flexible, it gives very easily, and then it starts to stiffen in a linear elastic way, but becomes increasingly stiffer for smaller changes in length the longer the connective tissues are stretched. They also show time-dependent properties, which means that they also stiffen differently under different loading rates, and they will behave much more stiff if they're loaded faster. Now, muscle activity also stiffens the foot by increasing the tension across the muscles and their attachment sites, therefore creating compressing forces across the joints that create stability and restrict motion. Finally, changing the shape of the foot's vault, or more usually referred to as an arch, although it is a more vault-like structure than an arch. But by changing the shape of the arch, you will alter compliance and stiffness levels through curvature mechanics. Higher vault profiles, higher curvature within a material increases the stiffness, whereas the lower profiles will tend to increase compliance. Now, this sets up the foot to be able to provide a line of events through the gait cycle, in that the vault of the foot, the arch of the foot is raised up after heel strike, okay, by extending the toes. So you get the windlass effect by pulling up the toes, which raises the arch profile. Tibialis posterior and peroneus longus are also activated, which stabilizes the midfoot and stiffens the midfoot up. So we land on a stiff rear foot, but with a nice plantar fat pad. We then stiffen the foot, and as we approach the forefoot loading, we now have a structure that we can unstiffen to apply compliance into the system. And what happens is you will see the toes come out of their extended angle as you load the forefoot into the ground. Tibialis posterior and peroneus longus activity reduces, and the foot is able to allow to flatten and spread into the support surface, helping to dissipate energy. Now, as we go then into mid-stance, we've got a flatter foot profile, which is flattening down quite rapidly, lengthening and widening. And then the next stage is that lengthening and widening will start to stiffen the foot through the connective tissues. We activate the muscles that stiffen the foot. And then with that stiff foot, we can then accelerate onto the forefoot and drive forward. And as we do that, the foot will shorten again, the arch profile will raise up again, which naturally starts to stiffen the foot, with the muscles relaxing. As we go towards the end of the terminal stance, the foot will become a little bit more compliant again, but by then our weight will have transferred onto the next step. So this gives us a rather interesting situation with foot pronation, in that we have multiple effects of stiffness when we pronate the foot. So by initially reducing the curvature of the arch height increases the compliance, allowing lengthening and widening to occur. But the lengthening and widening stretches and stiffens the connective tissues. Thus, initially reducing the vault increases compliance, but under increasing proneness and lengthening of the foot, it will become increasingly stiffened. The foot is flattest and longest at heel lift, meaning that the connective tissues should reach a peak of stiffness around heel lift. And as you say, at forefoot loading, we want the reverse to be the case. We want a nice high arch, which we can then relax to provide a nice cushioning ability when we load the forefoot. So relaxation of these contracted, stiffened vaults are part of the mechanism by which we dissipate energy through the foot. So pronation is not to be considered a bad thing. It is a good thing as long as it is adequate and it is providing the mechanical properties that the foot requires. And this is why we have an adaptable arch structure or vault-like structure underneath the foot. It's this ability to add an extra layer of compliance and stiffening mechanisms into the foot beyond just the connective tissues stretching and the muscles activating. It gives us this curvature mechanics into the equation of how we can control compliance and stiffness during gait. Now, different connective tissues, such as the short and long plantar ligaments and the spring ligaments and plantar aponeurosis, have different sequences of stress stiffening and release their stored energy through elastic recoil at different times in the gait cycle. More proximal structures, like the short plantar ligament, will complete their cycles of stretch and elastic recoil first. The plantar aponeurosis, on the other hand, will not start to shorten until well after heel lift. Now, this is indicating that the windlass effect it offers during terminal stance is not part of heel lift foot stiffening. It actually comes into play during the later part of terminal stance as you're approaching pre-swing, when the muscle activity is actually reducing within the foot. So it's a passive stiffening mechanism, but it's one to use in terminal stance rather than to actually achieve terminal stance and acceleration, which is probably quite contrary to what you may have heard in the past. So it's worth pointing that the windlass effect, very important for stiffening the foot prior to forefoot loading, but is not an important mechanism of stiffening the foot for acceleration, although it assists later in acceleration. Now, the amount of compliance and stiffness the foot can offer is dependent on the loading rate. Thus, gait speed is very important. Muscles are less able to create muscle contraction power at faster loading rates due to their force-velocity relationship, a contraction. That is, that muscles struggle to actually have bonding sites across their actin and myosin fibrils if the rate at which they have to contract is very fast. They're able to produce more of these at a slower contraction rate. This means at faster loading rates, the ability of muscles to dissipate energy and the power they generate for acceleration is compromised. So the faster you walk, the harder your muscles have to work. However, on the other hand, connective tissues behave more stiffly the faster they load through their viscoelastic time-dependent properties. Thus, the connective tissues are able to store more energy for release for acceleration to assist muscles at faster gait speeds. So in summary, slower walking speeds enable better muscle contraction powers, but faster walking speeds are better able to provide connective tissue energy storage. But slower walking speeds are better for using connective tissues to dissipate energy. But that results in less energy stored and therefore compromise acceleration power. So there are pros and cons to moving fast or moving slowly. Now let's consider again the force time curves, but this time using a Pendotti diagram. Now Pendotti diagrams show the direction of the ground reaction force vector, here shown during walking in barefoot gait, with vertical and horizontal forces combined together. So we get a better representation of the direction of the ground reaction forces being applied into the body. What you will notice here, I'll get the arrow up and running, there we go, is these initial little arrows that are pointing in an anterior direction, okay, which means that the foot is being pulled backwards into the ground. Now this is known as clawback, and it's the heel striking the ground being brought backwards which you're more likely to see in barefoot gait and in running, especially running human strike, obviously, but more likely to see running and barefoot walking than somebody who's shod, because the shoe usually hides this. But this is an event that occurs due to the activity of the hamstrings in late swing phase. The elastic recoil of hamstring activity that's slowing down the knee extension from the quadriceps pulls the heel back into the ground. So at this stage, what we'll get is a little anterior shear on the posterior aspect of the heel. And then that's followed by the rest of the heel strike. And you'll notice then that the vectors are actually pointing in a posterior direction, which means we're going to get a little bit of posterior shear now into the soft tissues in the heel. And that continues with the forefoot loading as well. So we're still slightly in an anterior direction, but we're getting far more compressive forces now because the forces are becoming more vertical. And that continues to the end of loading response. Now, the posteriorly directed ground reaction forces continue until absolute mid-stance, which is around about here, but the forces are reducing. And this is that period again of the leg lengthening and the center of mass rising up and over the foot. As we go into late mid-stance, the force vectors start to tip more into a anteriorly directed ground reaction force because the body is now pushing backwards against the ground. And these forces you can see are beginning to increase. And these are the ones that are associated with the mid-stance dorsiflexion moment, which is trying to bend through the middle of the foot. Okay, and that's being resisted by these plantar structures under the foot, stabilizing it so that the foot doesn't become too flat during the middle of the foot, or actually starts to buckle through the midfoot articulations. And that continues in this posterior direction from the body weight pushing into the ground. So the ground reaction force continues to push anteriorly all the way through to the peak of the acceleration phase at heel lift, and will continue all the way through to the end of the stance phase of gait. So in this period, we are getting an anterior shear from the ground reaction force, and at this stage, we're getting a posterior shear from the ground reaction force, although the heel does get that little anterior shear if you get clawback, but there are high compressive forces at the end of loading response, and again at heel lift as we go into acceleration. Now, the significance of this can be viewed from the paper by Stolwick, very worth looking at this paper, that reviews vertical forces at different walking speeds. And what you will note here is that at the fast walking speed, we get very high vertical forces, okay? But during the weight transfer phase, we get low vertical forces, which means we're going to get a lot of compression, but not so much bending moments during the mid-stance phase or weight transfer phase of gait. However, we do, again, get high vertical forces during the terminal stance acceleration. When we compare that to the slow walking speed, which you can see on the black line here, there is a delay in the loading of the peak vertical forces, and they are much lower. So the compression forces going into the feet at a slower walking speed are far less. And that is also true of the acceleration phase gait. But what this slow walking speed will tend to do is increase the weight transfer forces on the foot, which means potentially the dorsiflexion sagging bending moment through the middle of the arch of the foot is increased. Now, interestingly, the preferred walking speed seems to offer the best solution, which is our dashed line here. So for the preferred walking speed, we get a lower, longer impact peak than we get at faster walking speeds, and a sort of middle of the range mid-stance weight transfer force. And yet we're able to maintain the same acceleration peak that's similar to fast walking. Now that helps the body's locomotive energetics for the next step by adding the transfer, or sorry, aiding the transfer of the center of mass from step to step. So we still get that acceleration power, but we haven't had to suffer such a big impact force. Thus, it appears that self-selected preferred walking speeds represent humans' subconsciously achieved best energetic option. Now, where we have problems with diabetics is that diabetic soft tissues are set with higher stiffness as a result of glycation end products. Their viscoelastic properties are therefore altered, and this is found to be worse in neuropathic individuals. This means there is loss of normal stress to strain response, with tissues stiffening too quickly under load. Loading time strain rate dependency behavior is also changed, so that even at slow loading rates, the tissues are set too stiff. Both under shear and compression, diabetic connective tissues presents a steeper linear elastic zone, which means effectively their tissues have become more brittle. This makes it difficult for diabetics to dissipate and store energy without tissue damage. Now, diabetics also have another problem in that diabetes is a disease of accelerated aging. So rates of sarcopenia or muscle loss are high, leading to muscles that are less able to buffer impact energy or adjust the foot's stiffness adaptability by controlling changes in the foot's vault profile or arch profile. Motor neuropathy leads to muscle fascicle shortening, increasing the stiffness across the vault, often worsened by raising the vault higher under digital extension retraction as a result of the stiffened tendons. Such a stiff vault is unable or less able to resist in dissipating the ankle dorsiflexion moments of mid-stance, and these themselves are often raised as a result of stiffer plantar flexor muscles and tendons. The vault raising also decreases the overall surface area that the foot can offer for loading on the ground during stance phase, which is going to increase the peak pressures on those tissues that remain in contact with the ground. Autonomic neuropathy also causes the loss of blood flow control, increasing demineralization and collagen synthesis within the bone, substantially weakening it, especially around the entheses of ligaments and tendons. The result is that the foot is now set up for developing a Charcot's foot. The need to reduce loading forces on the foot drives diabetics to decrease their walking speed. They don't want those high impact and acceleration forces. But their tissues cannot respond by increasing their compliance to help dissipate the changing forces. Thus, mid-stance forces and loading duration on the foot increase, but the ability to adapt to such changes in gait has been lost. Now, stiff, fragile tissues become loaded for longer, unable to provide the compliance necessary for slower walking. Now, we've set you up some questions today. Having just said what I've said in the last few slides, you should be able to answer those very easily. So let us end with, again, another little look at the Penn-Dottu diagram, but consider it in regards to diabetes. So what we have now is tissues that are unable to deal with shear and vertical compression energy through the soft tissue dissipation that we would normally expect to see. So we have high vulnerability to those kind of forces, both in the loading response gait, particularly on the heel, but also the forefoot, and then again during the acceleration phase. But of course, now the heel is not part of the equation, it's all going through the forefoot. And then our other danger period is in late mid-stance through this period here, because we have a high bending moment going through the foot, much higher because our patients are walking slowly. So the danger periods for the heel become heel contact and early mid-stance. For the midfoot, the most vulnerable becomes weight transfer or mid-stance periods under the ankle dorsiflexion vault bending moment. The forefoot is vulnerable from forefoot loading, but particularly during terminal stance. And overall, we should start to see a need for therapies that can increase diabetics' tissue compliance, particularly for adding compliance for the ankle dorsiflexion moment that influences plantar peak pressures and loading times, and that also drives a potentially Charcot foot initiating bending moment across the now brittle, stiff, unresponsive foot, vault, or arch. And I will just finally add, very interestingly, on July the 13th this year, not fully published yet, but published online, a paper has been released in the International Journal of Lower Extremity Wounds, and it's titled Immediate Effects of Weight-Bearing Calf Stretches on ankle dorsiflexion, range of motion, and plantar pressures during gait in patients with diabetes mellitus. And I suggest that this, even if you've only got access to the abstract, you at least read the abstract of this paper. If you can actually access the paper, I think you're going to find it very interesting in the light of this lecture. So thank you very much. I thank the organisers for inviting me to speak today, and hope you've got something from this lecture. Thank you.